At the far edges of recorded history, where parchment ends and silence begins, there are questions that scholars rarely ask out loud. Not because the questions lack importance, but because they disturb the carefully arranged order of what we believe we already know. One such question drifts like dust across the ancient trade winds of Eurasia, carried from the stone halls of medieval Europe to the endless grasslands of Central Asia. It is a question that sounds implausible at first, almost absurd, and yet refuses to disappear once it has taken root in the mind. Did the Knights Templar, the most secretive and powerful order of the Middle Ages, reach as far as Mongolia? To imagine armored European knights riding beneath the vast skies of the Asian steppe feels like a scene borrowed from fiction. History textbooks do not show it. Museum exhibits do not mention it. Academic consensus rarely entertains it. And yet, history has a habit of hiding its most uncomfortable truths in plain sight, scattered across forgotten roads, dismissed chronicles, and symbols carved into stone where no one thinks to look. The Knights Templar were not ordinary soldiers. They were warrior monks sworn to poverty, obedience, and secrecy, yet they became one of the wealthiest and most influential institutions in medieval Europe. They built castles, controlled fleets, managed banking networks, and moved people, information, and resources across continents with an efficiency unmatched for their time. When such an organization vanishes abruptly, as the Templars did in the early 14th century, it leaves behind more than ruins and legends. It leaves behind unanswered movements, missing men, and silences where records should exist. In the year 1307, on a single Friday morning, the order was shattered. Arrest warrants were issued simultaneously across France. Templars were seized, imprisoned, tortured, and accused of heresy. Their wealth was confiscated, their leadership dismantled, and their name condemned. According to official history, this was the end. The order was dissolved. Its members were absorbed into other institutions or executed. The story, neat and contained, comes to a close. But endings in history are rarely so clean. What happened to the Templars who were not arrested? What became of the knights who vanished before the warrants arrived? Where did the ship sail that left certain ports just days before the crackdown? And why do fragments of evidence suggest movements not westward, toward the Atlantic, but eastward, toward lands most Europeans of the time supposedly never reached? To understand why this question matters, one must step back from the modern map and into the medieval world. Europe was not isolated. Asia was not unreachable. Between them stretched a vast, living network of roads, caravan routes, mountain passes, and desert crossings collectively known as the Silk Road. This was not a single road, but a system, an artery of trade, diplomacy, religion, and espionage connecting the Mediterranean to China. Goods traveled along it, certainly, but so did ideas, technologies, faiths, and people. Long before Marco Polo became a household name, merchants, missionaries, and envoys were already moving across Eurasia. Franciscan monks stood before Mongol Khans. Papal letters were carried into the heart of Asia. Intelligence flowed quietly between courts that outwardly appeared worlds apart. In this context, the idea of European knights traveling east becomes less fantastical and more unsettlingly plausible. The Mongol Empire, at its height, controlled more territory than any empire in history. It was ruthless in conquest, yet strangely tolerant in governance. It welcomed foreign specialists, engineers, doctors, scribes, and soldiers, regardless of religion. It absorbed knowledge wherever it found it. For a displaced military order hunted by European kings and abandoned by the church, the Mongol world may not have been a threat, but an opportunity. And yet, official history remains quiet on this possibility. There are no chapters titled The Templars in Asia. No clear declarations that they crossed the steppe or entered Mongol service. Instead, there are whispers, mentions of foreign knights in Eastern chronicles, cross-like symbols found far from Christendom, European-style armor described in places it should not exist. These fragments, taken individually, are easy to dismiss. Together, they form a pattern that demands attention. This documentary does not begin with certainty. It begins with curiosity, It does not promise proof beyond all doubt, but it offers something more dangerous to established narratives: a credible alternative. A re-examination of the same sources, the same timelines, the same roads, viewed from a different angle. Why would this story be forgotten? Perhaps because it challenges comforting assumptions. It suggests that medieval history was far more global than we prefer to admit. It blurs the boundaries between East and West. It hints that powerful institutions, both religious and political, may have had reasons to let certain truths fade quietly into obscurity. As we begin this journey, imagine the sound of wind moving through tall grass, the creak of leather saddles, the distant bells of caravan animals moving at dusk. Somewhere along these roads, men carried not just swords and armor, but secrets. Secrets of survival, of belief, of knowledge deemed too dangerous to remain in Europe. Whether they were Templars or not is the mystery we will unfold slowly, carefully, step by step. This is not a story meant to rush toward answers. It is meant to linger, to drift, to follow the long rhythm of history itself. Like the Silk Road, it winds rather than runs straight. And as with all forgotten roads, its true destination may only reveal itself to those willing to travel without certainty. Tonight, we begin not with a conclusion, but with a question history never asks, and perhaps never wanted answered. The Knights Templar did not begin as legends. They began as a solution to a problem. In the early 12th century, after the First Crusade had violently reshaped the political and religious landscape of the Middle East, Christian pilgrims began traveling in large numbers from Europe to Jerusalem. These journeys were long, dangerous, and often fatal. Bandits, warlords, and fractured territories turned pilgrimage into a gamble with death. Out of this chaos emerged a small group of knights who pledged their lives to protecting travelers along these roads. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History would remember them simply as the Knights Templar. At first, they were few in number and almost invisible. They owned little, wore plain white cloaks, and lived under strict monastic discipline. Their headquarters was said to be located near the ruins of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem, a detail that would later fuel centuries of speculation. What mattered most in these early years was not power, but trust. The church sanctioned them. Kings admired them. Pilgrims depended on them. In a world where loyalty was fragile, the Templars quickly became synonymous with reliability. But something remarkable happened as the decades passed. The Templars evolved. They did not remain merely guardians of roads and holy sites. They became administrators, logisticians, and financial innovators. They learned how to move resources across vast distances without physically transporting wealth. A pilgrim could deposit money with a Templar house in Paris and withdraw its equivalent in Jerusalem. In effect, the Templars created one of the earliest international banking systems. Gold no longer needed to cross dangerous lands. Information did. With this system came immense influence. Monarchs borrowed from the Templars. The papacy entrusted them with assets. Entire fleets, castles, and agricultural estates came under their control. Unlike other institutions, the Templars answered only to the Pope, not to kings or local authorities. This independence made them powerful and dangerous to those who ruled by debt and fear. Yet what truly set the Templars apart was not their wealth, but their structure. They were disciplined, secretive, and remarkably well-informed. Their commanderies were spread across Europe and the Near East, all connected by a network of messengers and coded communications. In an age without telegraphs or printing presses, the Templars moved information with astonishing speed. They knew which roads were safe, which rulers could be trusted, and which alliances were shifting behind closed doors. It is here, in this realm of information, that the Templars begin to resemble something more than a military order. They were intelligence gatherers, observers, archivists of a world in constant motion. Their travels brought them into contact with Islamic scholars, Jewish mystics, Eastern Christians, and merchants from Asia. Knowledge flowed in all directions, and the Templars stood at the crossroads. Many later legends would claim that during their time in Jerusalem, the Templars discovered hidden texts or sacred objects beneath the Temple Mount. Some speak of relics tied to the Ark of the Covenant. Others whisper of ancient wisdom inherited from forgotten civilizations. While such claims remain unproven, what is undeniable is that the Templars had access to libraries, to scholars, to ideas that most of medieval Europe never encountered. Their exposure to the Islamic world alone would have set them apart. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and geography in the Muslim world were centuries ahead of European standards. Maps were more accurate, navigation more advanced, trade routes better understood. The Templars did not merely fight in these lands. They learned from them. Over time, the image of the Templars shifted. To the common people, they were holy warriors. To kings, they were creditors. To the church, they were loyal servants. But among themselves, they were something else entirely. A brotherhood bound by secrets, rituals, and a worldview shaped by constant movement between cultures. This mobility is essential to understanding the question at the heart of this documentary. The Templars were not rooted to a single land. They were accustomed to long-distance travel, dangerous borders, and foreign customs. They spoke multiple languages. They negotiated with enemies. They adapted. For men like these, the idea of traveling beyond the familiar edges of Christendom was not unthinkable. It was routine. When the Mongols began to appear on the eastern horizon of European awareness in the 13th century, they were described with fear and confusion. They were seen as apocalyptic riders, a punishment sent by God. But behind the terror was opportunity. European rulers sought alliances with them against common enemies. The papacy sent envoys eastward. Information began flowing once more along ancient routes. If anyone in Europe was equipped to understand, navigate, and exploit these connections, it was the Templars. Their network already stretched across the Mediterranean. Their experience in hostile environments was unmatched. Their independence from local rulers allowed them to move where others could not. And perhaps most importantly, their secrecy allowed them to act without leaving obvious traces. As the 13th century drew to a close, tensions between the Templars and European monarchs intensified. Their wealth became a target, their autonomy a threat. Rumors of heresy, secret rituals, and forbidden knowledge began to circulate. Whether these accusations were sincere or manufactured matters less than their effect. They prepared the ground for betrayal. When the crackdown came, it came fast. Too fast for a complete accounting of where every knight was, where every asset lay, and where every road led. Some Templars were captured, others disappeared, and disappearances in history are rarely random. To understand what may have happened next, whether eastward journeys were possible or even likely, we must first understand that the Knights Templar were never confined by the mental borders we impose on the medieval world today. They lived in a connected reality, a global reality, centuries before the word existed. And in that reality, the road to Mongolia was not a myth. It was simply another road. The morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, arrived without warning, and yet it would echo through history as one of the most carefully coordinated acts of betrayal the medieval world had ever witnessed. Across France, royal agents moved simultaneously, carrying sealed orders from King Philip IV. At dawn, they knocked on the doors of Templar commanderies, read aloud accusations of heresy, and placed knights under arrest. There were no trials yet, no evidence presented, only chains, confiscations, and silence. By nightfall, an order that had stood for nearly 2 centuries was effectively decapitated. To the outside world, the speed of the operation suggested total victory for the crown. But beneath the surface, something did not add up. The Knights Templar were masters of preparation. They understood political currents. They monitored threats. They had spies in courts and allies in unexpected places. It strains belief to imagine that such an organization was entirely caught off guard. Even contemporary observers noticed the gaps. Not all Templars were arrested. Not all commanderies were seized. Not all assets were accounted for. In some regions, particularly outside France, royal authority was weaker, and the arrests were delayed, incomplete, or resisted. In others, the Templars seemed to vanish before officials arrived, leaving behind empty halls and unanswered questions. The official narrative tells us that those who escaped arrest simply blended back into civilian life or joined other monastic orders. Yet this explanation feels inadequate when weighed against the scale of the Templars' infrastructure. These were not wandering monks with nothing to lose. They controlled fleets, storehouses, fortresses, and networks of communication. A sudden collapse would not result in quiet dispersal. It would trigger movement. One of the earliest mysteries surrounds the Templar fleet. Records indicate that a number of Templar ships left port shortly before the arrest began. Their destination was never recorded. Popular theories place them in Scotland or Portugal, where Templars found relative safety. But the sea does not flow in only one direction, and ships are only part of the story. The land routes matter just as much. The Templars had long operated along the eastern Mediterranean, in Cyprus, the Levant, and Anatolia. From there, the road eastward did not end. It continued. Trade routes connected these regions to Persia, Central Asia, and beyond. Merchants traveled them regularly. Envoys moved quietly under diplomatic protection. These roads were dangerous, yes, but danger had never deterred the Templars. As arrests spread across Europe, news traveled unevenly. A commandery in Paris might fall in a day, while one in the eastern Mediterranean could receive warnings weeks in advance. Those warnings mattered. They allowed time to move people, objects, and knowledge out of reach. They allowed decisions to be made that would shape the fate of the order in ways history may never fully record. What would such decisions look like? To flee west was to sail in a land still governed by Christian kings, many of whom were already hostile or would soon be pressured by the papacy. To flee north or south offered limited sanctuary. But to flee east, beyond the political reach of Europe, beyond papal authority, offered something else entirely. Distance, obscurity, survival. This is where the Mongol world enters the story, not as a sudden leap, but as a logical extension of existing knowledge. By 1307, the Mongols were not unknown monsters. They were a dominant force, controlling vast territories from Eastern Europe to China. European rulers had already exchanged letters with Mongol leaders. Religious envoys had already stood in their courts. The idea that land existed beyond Europe where the Pope's writ did not run was not theoretical. It was proven. For a hunted order facing extinction, such lands would have been more than a refuge. They would have been a reset. The Templar skill set aligned uncannily well with what the Mongols valued. They were disciplined soldiers, experienced in cavalry warfare. They understood fortifications. They had administrative expertise. They had access to foreign knowledge and trade connections. The Mongols, pragmatic above all else, had no ideological reason to reject them. Yet history records no mass migration, no formal alliance, no declaration. And perhaps that is the point. Survival often requires invisibility. The men who fled would not have traveled as an army. They would have broken into small groups, blending into caravans, adopting the appearance of merchants, pilgrims, or mercenaries. Their armor could be melted down or traded. Their symbols hidden, their identities dissolved into the flow of the Silk Road. And what are their treasures? This question haunts the story like a shadow. The Templars were accused of hoarding immense wealth, yet much of it was never recovered. Gold can vanish, documents can burn, but knowledge, maps, codes, contacts, travels more easily than any chest of coins. It is possible that what the Templars carried eastward was not wealth in the conventional sense, but something far more valuable: information, routes, alliances, sacred texts, technologies. Things that could not be seized by a king's decree. As torture extracted confessions from those captured, the church sought to close the chapter. Executions followed. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314, proclaiming innocence with his final breath. To the public, this was the end of the Templars. But endings written by victors are rarely complete. What remains unsettling is how quickly the narrative shifts from collapse to silence. There is little discussion of pursuit beyond Europe. No record of efforts to track fugitives across Asia. No mention of concern over what knowledge may have escaped. It is as if the story simply stops where Europe's mental map once ended. This silence invites interpretation. Was it ignorance? Or was it convenience? As we move forward, we must hold two truths in tension. First, that definitive proof is elusive. Second, that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in a world where records were fragile and power dictated memory. The shock of 1307 did not end the Knights Templar. It scattered them, and in that scattering lies the possibility that some did not vanish into obscurity, but traveled farther than history ever expected, following roads already worn smooth by centuries of trade toward a horizon where new empires ruled and old accusations held no power. The flight from Europe was not a single event. It was a process, and its destination may have been much farther east than we have ever been taught to imagine. When discussing the fate of the Knights Templar after the arrests of 1307, history tends to circle the same familiar destinations. Scotland, Portugal, sometimes Switzerland. These places have become comfortable conclusions, geographically close, politically convenient, and safely within the boundaries of Europe. They allow the story to end without challenging the deeper assumptions about how far medieval people could travel or how interconnected their world truly was. Yet these destinations, repeated so often, may reveal more about modern imagination than medieval reality. Scotland, at the time, was excommunicated and at odds with the papacy, making it a plausible refuge for Templars fleeing church authority. Portugal, under a sympathetic king, absorbed former Templars into a newly named order, allowing them to continue operating under royal protection. These explanations are not wrong, but they may be incomplete. They assume that survival meant staying close to familiar power structures, when in fact the Templars had every reason to escape them entirely. The more one examines the political climate of early 14th century Europe, the clearer it becomes that no place within Christendom was truly safe. Even kingdoms initially tolerant of the Templars were under immense pressure from the papacy and from France. Alliances shifted, promises eroded. What was safe one year could become dangerous the next. For an order built on long-term strategy, this instability would have been unacceptable. The Templars thought in generations, not seasons. Their fortresses were designed to last centuries. Their financial systems planned for continuity, not improvisation. It is difficult to imagine such an organization placing its remaining members in lands that could easily turn hostile under diplomatic pressure. If survival was the goal, distance, not proximity, offered the greatest protection. To understand alternative routes, one must abandon the modern assumption that Europe was the center of the medieval world. In truth, Europe was a western fringe. The economic and cultural heart of Eurasia lay to the east, along the Silk Road. Cities like Samarkand, Bokhara, and Kashgar were thriving centers of trade, learning, and diplomacy. Caravans flowed through them continuously, carrying silk, spices, metals, manuscripts, and people. These routes were not secret. They were well established and well mapped by merchants long before Europeans paid them serious attention. The Templars, however, were not ordinary Europeans. Their presence in the Levant placed them at the gateway to these eastern networks. From ports like Acre and cities like Antioch, the road east was already open. Beyond Anatolia lay Persia. Beyond Persia lay Central Asia. And beyond that, the vast territories of the Mongol Empire. Each step eastward carried travelers farther from papal authority and closer to political systems that operated on entirely different principles. The Mongols did not care about heresy trials in France. They did not recognize the Pope as a universal authority. They valued loyalty, competence, and utility. For foreign specialists, especially military ones, This was a world of opportunity rather than danger. Yet mainstream history rarely entertains this path. Why? Part of the answer lies in the way historical narratives are shaped. Western history has long been written as a self-contained story, with Europe at its center and Asia as a distant backdrop. Movements that challenge this framing are often minimized or ignored, not out of malice, but habit. Another reason is the nature of evidence. European archives are rich in records of what happened within Europe. They are far less detailed when it comes to what happened beyond its borders. If a group of Templars traveled east and assimilated into foreign systems, they would leave fewer traces in European documents. Their story would not vanish. It would simply move elsewhere. And that elsewhere has rarely been examined with the same intensity. Travel eastward did not require fleets or dramatic migrations. It required patience. Caravans moved slowly, deliberately. Travelers joined and left along the way. Identities blurred. A knight could become a guard. A monk could become a translator. The further east one traveled, the less one's past mattered. This mode of movement suited the Templars perfectly. They were trained in discretion. They understood how to operate without drawing attention. Their survival depended on it. There's also the question of intent. Why would Templars choose the East specifically? Beyond safety, there was continuity. The East represented a place where the Order's skills remained relevant. In Europe, their military role was diminishing. Crusades had failed. Political trust had eroded. In Asia, vast empires required administrators, soldiers, and advisors. The Templars did not need to abandon who they were. They could simply apply their expertise in a new context. Furthermore, the East held knowledge. Libraries, astronomical traditions, medical texts, philosophical schools. For an order rumored to value sacred and esoteric knowledge, these regions would have held immense appeal. If the Templars carried texts or teachings deemed dangerous in Europe, the East offered places where such knowledge could survive without persecution. There's also a strategic silence surrounding these routes. European authorities had little incentive to publicize the idea that Templars escaped beyond their reach. Doing so would undermine the narrative of control and justice they sought to project. It was easier to declare the order destroyed than to admit it had simply moved. Over time, repetition hardened assumption into fact. Scotland became the answer. Portugal became the answer. The question of the East faded, not because it was disproven, but because it was never fully asked. Yet when one follows the roads themselves rather than the stories told about them, a different picture emerges. The Silk Road did not end at Europe's edge. It invited travelers onward. And for those fleeing annihilation, it offered something Europe could not: anonymity on a continental scale. In choosing to look east, we do not reject the Western routes. We expand the map. We allow for the possibility that history is wider than the borders drawn around it. And in doing so, we open the door to a story that is not about escape alone, but transformation. The roads less traveled are often ignored not because they are unlikely, but because they lead us away from comfortable conclusions. And for the Knights Templar, comfort was never the goal. Survival was. To modern minds, the Silk Road often appears as a romantic abstraction, a thin line on an old map, a poetic name for a distant past. But in the medieval world, the Silk Road was not a symbol. It was a living system, a vast, pulsing network of routes that stretched from the ports of the Mediterranean to the heart of China, binding together civilizations that today are treated as separate chapters of history. Long before the age of steam or steel, this network moved goods, ideas, religions, and people across continents with astonishing regularity. The term Silk Road itself is misleading, suggesting a single path or a single commodity. In reality, it was many roads, branching and rejoining, shifting with seasons, politics, and geography. Caravans adjusted their routes to avoid war zones, to follow water sources, or to reach cities where markets were flourishing. This flexibility made the Silk Road resilient. Even when empires fell, the roads endured. By the 13th century, these routes were more active than ever. The rise of the Mongol Empire created an unprecedented condition known as the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative stability across vast territories. Under Mongol rule, trade was protected, banditry suppressed, and travelers granted safe passage through regions that had once been deadly to outsiders. For the first time in history, it was possible to travel from the Mediterranean to East Asia under a single overarching political system. This mattered profoundly. Merchants from Venice, Genoa, and the Levant moved eastward with silks, glassware, and silver. They returned with spices, paper, gunpowder, and knowledge that would later reshape Europe. Missionaries followed them, driven by the hope of conversion or alliance. Diplomats carried letters sealed with wax and ambition. Spies traveled quietly, listening more than speaking. The Silk Road was not just commerce, it was intelligence. For an organization like the Knights Templar, whose power depended on movement and information, this network would have been invaluable. They already operated along many of its western arteries. Ports like Acre and cities like Antioch were not endpoints, they were gateways. From there, the road extended naturally eastward into Anatolia, Persia, and Central Asia. Travel along the Silk Road required more than courage. It demanded cultural literacy. Languages shifted every few hundred miles. Customs changed. Religious practices blended and overlapped. But this diversity was not a barrier. It was the defining feature of the road. Travelers learned to adapt or perish. The Templars, shaped by decades of life in the multicultural environment of the Crusader states, were uniquely prepared for this world. They negotiated with Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike. They understood the politics of tolerance and pragmatism. Their survival had always depended on knowing when to fight and when to compromise. Caravans themselves were marvels of organization. Hundreds of animals moved together, guarded by armed escorts, led by guides who memorized the stars and the land. Nights were spent in caravanserais, fortified and built specifically to support long-distance trade. These places were hubs of exchange, where news traveled faster than goods, and where strangers became temporary allies. In such spaces, identities softened. A man's past mattered less than his utility. A skilled fighter was valued regardless of origin. A translator could earn protection. A scribe could trade literacy for passage. For those seeking to disappear without dying, there was no better place. The dangers were real, but manageable. Deserts tested endurance. Mountains demanded patience. Disease and betrayal lurked everywhere. Yet the road persisted because the rewards outweighed the risks. And under Mongol oversight, many of these risks were reduced. This challenges a common misconception, that medieval travel was rare, reckless, and disorganized. In truth, it was structured, supported, and surprisingly international. Knowledge of routes, seasons, and safe havens was passed down through generations of traders. Maps existed, though they looked nothing like modern ones. Navigation relied on memory, stars, and shared experience. If one asks whether it was possible for Europeans, Templars or otherwise, to reach Central Asia or beyond, the answer is unequivocally yes. The real question is not whether the road allowed it, but whether the circumstances made it likely. By the early 14th century, the Templars faced annihilation in Europe. Their traditional bases were compromised. Their authority was revoked. Their future was erased. The Silk Road offered something radically different, a chance to move beyond the story written for them. It also offered scale. To vanish within Europe was difficult. Records were dense. Politics were personal. But to vanish within Asia was to dissolve into a system designed to absorb movement. A handful of men traveling east would attract little notice among the constant flow of merchants, monks, and mercenaries. The Silk Road also intersected with another critical factor, the Mongol appetite for knowledge. The empire actively recruited specialists from conquered lands. Engineers from China were sent west. Doctors from Persia traveled east. Administrators moved wherever they were needed. Foreigners were assets, not anomalies. This meant that travelers did not need to remain anonymous forever. They could integrate, serve, contribute. The road did not just lead away from danger. It led toward new structures of belonging. The idea that the Silk Road was merely a backdrop to European history diminishes its true role. It was a central artery of the medieval world, and for those willing to follow it, it led not to exile, but to transformation. As we continue, the road itself becomes more than a setting. It becomes a character, a witness to countless journeys lost to memory. Somewhere among them may have walked men who once wore white cloaks marked with red crosses, now stripped of symbols, carrying only what they could not afford to lose. The Silk Road does not preserve names. It preserves motion, and motion is often where history hides its greatest secrets. When the Mongols first appeared on Europe's horizon in the early 13th century, they were not seen as potential allies. They were described as a storm from the east, an unstoppable force that crushed kingdoms and left entire regions silent in its wake. Chroniclers wrote of cities erased and armies annihilated. To medieval Europe, already steeped in apocalyptic thinking, the Mongols seemed less like men and more like instruments of divine punishment. Yet fear has a way of evolving into curiosity, and curiosity into strategy. As Mongol armies advanced into Eastern Europe, something unexpected happened. Instead of continuing their conquest westward indefinitely, they withdrew. The reason was internal, succession disputes following the death of a great Khan. But to European rulers, the withdrawal felt like a reprieve. It also raised questions. Who were these people? What did they want? And could they be reasoned with? Gradually, the image of the Mongols shifted. They were no longer viewed only as destroyers, but as a political reality that could not be ignored. Europe, fractured and divided, began to consider the unthinkable, alliance with the enemy of their enemy. At the time, the Islamic powers of the Middle East remained a central concern for Christian Europe. Crusades had failed to secure lasting control of the Holy Land. Military resources were exhausted. The idea that the Mongols, who had devastated Islamic territories in Persia and Mesopotamia, might be turned into allies against common foes was tantalizing. This led to one of the most extraordinary episodes of medieval diplomacy. Papal envoys were sent eastward, not soldiers, but monks, Franciscans, and Dominicans trained in languages and theology. Their mission was twofold: gather intelligence and explore the possibility of cooperation. Men like Giovanni de Pien del Carpine and William of Rubruck traveled thousands of miles across hostile terrain to reach Mongol courts. They recorded what they saw in astonishing detail: customs, beliefs, military organization, and political structure. These journeys shattered European assumptions. The Mongols were not mindless barbarians. They were disciplined, pragmatic, and surprisingly tolerant. They allowed freedom of worship. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and shamans all lived within their empire. What mattered was loyalty, not doctrine. Letters were exchanged between popes and khans. Proposals were floated. Hopes of joint campaigns were discussed, even if they never fully materialized. What mattered most was the precedent. Europe and the Mongol Empire were in contact. The road between them was open. For organizations like the Knights Templar, this contact was not peripheral, it was central. The Templars were deeply embedded in the geopolitics of the Crusades. They monitored alliances. They advised kings. They gathered intelligence on Muslim powers. If anyone in Europe understood the strategic implications of Mongol expansion, it was them. Moreover, the Templars had their own reasons to watch the Mongols closely. Mongol forces had reached the edges of the Crusader world. They had clashed with Muslim armies that the Templars had fought for generations. In some instances, Mongol and Christian forces even fought alongside each other, if only temporarily. This created a strange overlap of interests. Imagine the perspective of a Templar commander in the Levant. The traditional balance of power was collapsing. New empires were rising. Old enemies were being destroyed by forces from the east. The world was changing rapidly, and survival depended on understanding that change. The Mongols also represented something else: neutrality toward European religious conflicts. They had no interest in papal politics, no stake in accusations of heresy, no allegiance to French kings. 4 Templars facing persecution from within Christendom. The Mongol world offered a political blank slate. European envoys were not the only ones traveling these roads. Information flowed both ways. Mongol scouts and diplomats reached the edges of Europe. Knowledge of European military orders would not have escaped their notice. The Templars, with their discipline and fortification expertise, would have stood out. What if, instead of an official alliance between empires, there were quieter, more personal arrangements? What if individuals, rather than states, crossed these boundaries? History tends to focus on treaties and declarations, but survival often operates in the shadows. A handful of experienced warriors entering Mongol service would not require formal agreements. It would require only usefulness and trust. And usefulness was something the Templars had in abundance. Their experience in siege warfare, logistics, and command would have been invaluable to an empire constantly expanding and consolidating territory. Their familiarity with Islamic lands and languages would have enhanced Mongol campaigns in the Middle East. Their administrative skills could support governance. We must also consider timing. The collapse of the Templars in Europe coincided with a period when the Mongol Empire was still vast, flexible, and open to foreign expertise. This window would not remain open forever. Later generations of Mongol rulers would become more localized, more absorbed into regional cultures. But in the early 14th century, the empire still operated as a transcontinental system. This convergence of desperation and opportunity is difficult to ignore. Official history offers no document stating that the Knights Templar allied with the Mongols. But history is full of informal alliances that left no paper trail, especially when secrecy was a survival strategy. As Europe struggled to define the Mongols as monsters or messengers of God, some individuals may have already moved beyond fear into pragmatism. They may have seen in the Mongol Empire not the end of the world, but the beginning of a new one. And in that world, loyalty was earned, not inherited. Authority was pragmatic, not theological. And the road east was not a path into darkness, but into possibility. To understand why the Mongol world could have offered refuge or opportunity to displaced Knights Templar, one must first strip away centuries of myth and fear surrounding the Mongol Empire. Popular memory often paints the Mongols as destroyers alone, riders who burned cities and vanished into the steppe. While their conquests were undeniably brutal, this image captures only one phase of a far more complex system. Beneath the violence lay an empire built on adaptability, intelligence, and an unusually modern approach to governance. At its height, the Mongol Empire stretched from the plains of Hungary to the shores of the Pacific Ocean. It connected cultures that had never previously been governed under a single political framework. Such an empire could not survive on terror alone. It required structure. It required information. And above all, it required talent. The Mongols were pragmatic to an extreme. They did not demand cultural assimilation in the way many empires did. Conquered peoples were not forced to abandon their religions or customs as long as they paid tribute and remained loyal. Priests, monks, scholars, and artisans were often spared during conquests and resettled where their skills were needed most. Knowledge was considered a resource. This tolerance was not born of idealism, but strategy. The Mongols understood that diversity was an advantage. A Christian engineer from Europe, a Muslim physician from Persia, and a Chinese administrator could all serve the same Khan if their expertise strengthened the empire. Belief was secondary. Utility was everything. For a group like the Knights Templar, this worldview would have been profoundly different from the one they had known in Europe. In Christendom, religious identity defined legitimacy. Accusations of heresy were enough to destroy centuries of service. In the Mongol world, such accusations would have been meaningless. A man's worth was measured by what he could do, not what he believed. The Mongol military itself was a study in disciplined flexibility. It relied heavily on cavalry, mobility, and psychological warfare. Units were organized with mathematical precision. Communication was rapid. Intelligence gathering was constant. Spies and scouts operated far ahead of armies, mapping terrain and assessing resistance. This emphasis on information mirrored practices the Templars themselves had long employed. The Mongols also valued foreign military traditions. They absorbed tactics from every culture they encountered: Chinese siege engines, Persian administration, Turkic cavalry methods. There was no shame in borrowing. Innovation was survival. Imagine, then, the arrival of foreign knights trained in fortified warfare, accustomed to discipline, and experienced in fighting both Eastern and Western enemies. Such men would not be seen as relics of a failed crusade, but as assets to be evaluated and potentially integrated. Beyond the battlefield, the Mongol Empire required administrators. Governing vast territories demanded record-keeping, taxation systems, and legal structures. The Mongols often delegated these tasks to outsiders who had experience managing complex institutions. The Templars, who had overseen banking networks and landholdings across Europe, would have possessed precisely this kind of expertise. There is also the matter of mobility. The Mongols were nomadic at heart. They understood movement not as instability, but as strength. Permanent roots were less important than adaptability. For Templars who had been forced to abandon their European bases, this philosophy would have resonated. It validated survival through change. Strategically, the Mongol Empire occupied a unique position. It stood outside the ideological battles that consumed Europe. Papal decrees held no power there. Royal vendettas did not reach its courts. This made it a natural refuge for those targeted by European politics. But refuge alone does not explain everything. There had to be incentive. The incentive lay in mutual benefit. The Mongols gained skilled personnel. The Templars gained protection, relevance, and a future. Such arrangements would not require formal announcements or written agreements. They would exist quietly, pragmatically, and invisibly to those not directly involved. It is important to note that Mongol rulers often employed Christians. Nestorian Christianity, in particular, had a strong presence in Central Asia and among certain Mongol elites. Churches existed along the Silk Road. Crosses were not unknown symbols. A Christian warrior in Mongol lands would not necessarily stand out. This further complicates the historical silence. If Templars integrated into existing Christian communities within the empire, their presence would blend rather than disrupt. Over time, distinctions would fade. Names would change. Lineages would adapt. What began as survival could evolve into legacy. Power in the Mongol world was not static. Khans rose and fell. Regions shifted between direct rule and local autonomy. This fluidity allowed individuals to move, to reattach themselves to new patrons, to disappear and re-emerge elsewhere. For those accustomed to rigid hierarchies and permanent identities, this was freedom disguised as chaos. From a strategic perspective, the Mongol Empire was also a bridge between worlds. Information from China could reach the Mediterranean. Innovations like paper currency, printing, and gunpowder traveled westward. Ideas flowed with the caravans. Those positioned within this system stood at the crossroads of history. If the Templars carried knowledge, geographical, scientific, or esoteric, the Mongol network offered a means to preserve and disseminate it beyond Europe's reach. In this sense, the empire was not merely a refuge, but a vessel. Critics may argue that such integration would have left clearer traces. But this assumes that history records everything of importance. In reality, history preserves what institutions choose to remember. The Mongols did not chronicle every foreign specialist. European chroniclers rarely followed their subjects beyond familiar borders. Between these gaps, entire lives vanish. What remains is possibility grounded in context. A displaced order, skilled and adaptable. An empire hungry for talent and indifferent to European conflicts. Roads connecting them, open and protected. Timing aligned by crisis and opportunity. The Mongol Empire was not a dead end. It was a horizon. And for those who reached it, The question was no longer how to survive persecution, but how to redefine themselves in a world that valued strength, intelligence, and adaptability above all else. History does not always speak in clear declarations. Sometimes it whispers, through fragments, marginal notes, half-forgotten chronicles, and accounts written by observers who did not fully understand what they were seeing. When exploring the possibility of Knights Templar reaching deep into Asia, it is within these whispers that the story begins to take shape. Across Persian, Armenian, and Central Asian sources from the 13th and 14th centuries, there appear occasional references to foreign warriors unlike those native to the region. They are described as heavily armored, disciplined, and distinct in both appearance and behavior. Some accounts speak of men who fought on horseback but carried themselves differently from Mongol or Turkic cavalry. Others mention warriors who prayed in unfamiliar ways, marked themselves with gestures unknown to local religions, or carried symbols that observers struggled to interpret. These references are rare, scattered, and often ambiguous. But that is precisely what makes them intriguing. They do not read like legends invented centuries later. They appear instead as puzzled observations, written by chroniclers who encountered something unexpected and lacked the framework to fully explain it. Persian historians, meticulous record keepers by medieval standards, documented the diversity of peoples within the Mongol Empire. They wrote of Chinese engineers, Arab administrators, Russian soldiers, and European travelers. In this context, the mention of foreign knights is not extraordinary. What is extraordinary is the way some descriptions align with what we know of Western military orders. In a few accounts, these foreign warriors are said to follow strict internal discipline, obeying commanders without question. They are portrayed as loyal to each other above all else, bound by oaths that outsiders could not penetrate. This sense of brotherhood, so central to the Templar identity, was not common among mercenary groups of the time, which were often loosely organized and motivated by pay rather than ideology. Some Armenian chronicles, written at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, describe encounters with Western Christians who had traveled far beyond their homelands. Armenia, itself long a meeting point of empires, was familiar with cultural blending. Yet even there, certain travelers stood out. They were described as men who had abandoned their lands and pasts, moving eastward with no intention of return. Chinese sources from the Yuan dynasty, though less explicit, also contribute to the mystery. They note the presence of foreign soldiers and advisors serving Mongol rulers, men from lands beyond the western seas. While these accounts rarely specify religious affiliation, they emphasize difference. These foreigners were not merely traders. They were specialists, fighters, strategists. The challenge lies in interpretation. None of these sources explicitly names the Knights Templar. They do not use European terminology. They describe what was visible, not what was hidden. Symbols may have been altered, identities obscured, names changed to fit local tongues. And yet patterns emerge. The timing aligns closely with the collapse of the Templars in Europe. The geography aligns with Silk Road routes under Mongol control. The descriptions align with a group accustomed to discipline, secrecy, and long-distance movement. Skeptics argue that these references could describe any number of Europeans, mercenaries, adventurers, or missionaries. And that is true, but such explanations often fail to account for the consistency of certain traits: secrecy, internal cohesion, and a tendency to operate as a closed brotherhood rather than individuals. Missionaries, for example, traveled openly. They sought converts. They wrote letters back to Europe. Their journeys were documented precisely because they wanted them to be. Mercenaries sought recognition and reward. Their service was transactional. The figures described in these Eastern whispers seem different. They appear as men who did not seek attention, who integrated quietly, and whose origins were deliberately vague. That is not the profile of a missionary or a fortune seeker. It is the profile of survivors. There are also symbolic clues. In some regions of Central Asia, archaeologists and travelers have reported carvings and markings that resemble crosses. Not the ornate crosses of later Christianity, but simple geometric forms. Such symbols were not unknown in the East, where Nestorian Christians had long established communities. But certain designs bear closer resemblance to Western Crusader iconography than to Eastern Christian traditions. Again, none of this constitutes proof. But history rarely offers proof in cases involving secrecy and displacement. Instead, it offers convergence. Independent sources, written in different languages by observers with no reason to coordinate their accounts, describe similar anomalies. That convergence deserves attention. It is also important to consider what is missing. European chronicles rarely follow individuals once they leave Christendom. Asian chronicles, focused on their own political centers, often lacked interest in the precise origins of foreign specialists. Between these two perspectives lies a blind spot, a space where people can exist without being fully recorded. This blind spot is not empty. It is simply undocumented. Modern historians tend to favor what can be neatly categorized. The idea that members of a powerful European order might have dissolved into the fabric of an Asian empire challenges those categories. It suggests a fluidity of identity that feels uncomfortably modern. And yet, medieval people were far more adaptable than we often assume. Names changed, allegiances shifted, religions blended. Survival demanded flexibility. If some Templars reached the East, they would not have announced themselves as such. Doing so would have defeated the purpose of escape. They would have shed symbols, adopted new roles, and allowed time to erase their origins. The whispers remain because complete erasure is impossible. Traces linger, in unexpected descriptions, in puzzled remarks, in symbols carved where no one thought to remove them. As we move deeper into this mystery, the question shifts. It is no longer simply whether the Knights Templar reached Asia. It becomes a broader inquiry into how history remembers those who choose silence over survival, anonymity over martyrdom. The East did not record their names. The West stopped looking for them. Between these two absences, a story waits, quiet, fragmented, and persistent. When written records fall silent, material culture often continues to speak. Stone, wood, and metal remember what parchment forgets. Across the vast regions once bound together by the Silk Road, there exist markings and symbols that do not fit neatly into local artistic traditions. These symbols are easy to overlook, easy to dismiss as coincidence or misinterpretation. Yet when viewed collectively, they raise questions that refuse to remain buried. Among the most intriguing of these are cross-like carvings found in parts of Central Asia, Persia, and even farther east. Crosses, of course, are not exclusive to Western Christianity. Eastern Christian communities, particularly Nestorians, had established churches along the Silk Road centuries before the Mongols. Their crosses, however, followed distinctive styles, often ornate, flowing, or integrated into local motifs. The symbols that provoke curiosity are different. They are stark, geometric, minimalist. Some are simple, equal-armed crosses carved into stone blocks or cliff faces. Others resemble the cross petit, a form closely associated with Crusader orders, including the Knights Templar. These markings appear in places where no permanent Western Christian settlements are known to have existed. Skeptics argue that such symbols could have been left by later travelers, missionaries, or even modern visitors. This is a valid caution, but context matters. Some of these carvings are weathered to a degree consistent with medieval origin. Others are found in locations that were once active caravan routes or military outposts during the Mongol era. Symbols also appear on objects rather than structures. Seals, rings, and fragments of metalwork unearthed in archaeological contexts sometimes bear marks that resemble Western heraldic designs. Again, none bear inscriptions clearly identifying the Knights Templar. But secrecy would demand precisely that absence. The Templars were known for using coded symbols and subtle markers. Their internal communications often relied on signs that only initiates would recognize. In Europe, some of their carvings remain visible on churches and fortresses, simple enough to blend into religious art, yet distinctive to those who knew what to look for. If Templars traveled east and sought to mark safe locations, burial sites, or meeting points, they would not have used overt symbols. They would have chosen forms that could pass unnoticed or be misattributed to local traditions. There is also the question of architecture. Along parts of the Silk Road, particularly in regions that saw Mongol military presence, there are ruins whose construction techniques differ subtly from local norms. Fortified structures with rectangular layouts, narrow arrow slits, and defensive features reminiscent of European castles appear sporadically. Most historians attribute these to generic military architecture or later influences. Yet the resemblance persists. European crusader fortresses were designed with specific defensive philosophies. Their builders understood prolonged sieges, choke points, and layered defenses. When similar design elements appear far from Europe, the possibility of shared knowledge arises. Shared knowledge does not require permanent settlement. It requires presence. Markers can also be symbolic rather than architectural. Some sites feature recurring geometric patterns, interlocking shapes, circles within squares, that resemble motifs found in Templar-associated structures in Europe. These shapes carried layered meanings, blending Christian symbolism with mathematical and philosophical concepts. To outsiders, they appear decorative. To insiders, they encode ideas. The challenge lies in interpretation. Without inscriptions, without names, symbols resist definitive explanation. But this resistance does not render them meaningless. Instead, it invites careful comparison. When similar symbols appear across distant regions connected by known travel routes, coincidence becomes less convincing. When they appear in contexts aligned with periods of upheaval and migration, they invite historical imagination grounded in evidence. There is also the matter of deliberate erasure. European authorities, eager to eliminate the Templars' legacy, destroyed or repurposed their sites. In Asia, there was no such motivation. Symbols left there would not have been targeted. They would simply have been ignored, preserved by indifference. Time further complicates matters. Centuries of rebuilding, weathering, and reinterpretation blur original meanings. Local populations may incorporate old symbols into new traditions, unaware of their origins. What was once a marker becomes a mystery. Critics often demand a single definitive artifact, a sword inscribed with a Templar seal, a document bearing a knight's name. History rarely offers such clarity in cases of secrecy. Instead, it offers accumulation, pattern, probability. Symbols on stone do not shout. They whisper. They require patience, context, and willingness to consider uncomfortable possibilities. The presence of crosses in Asia does not prove the presence of Templars, but it does prove that Western Christian symbols traveled farther east than commonly acknowledged. It proves that cultural boundaries were permeable. It proves that ideas and identities could move quietly across continents. In the context of a hunted order seeking survival beyond Europe, such permeability becomes significant. If the Templars reached the East, they would not have built cathedrals or raised banners. They would have left traces subtle enough to escape notice, durable enough to survive time. Stone endures, and in its endurance, it preserves questions. As we continue, we must resist the urge for certainty and instead embrace the method history often demands, listening closely to what remains, even when it speaks softly. No discussion of the Knights Templar can avoid the gravity of the objects said to be bound to their fate. Long after their destruction, stories persisted that the Order had guarded treasures not measured in gold alone, relics of immense spiritual, symbolic, and political power. Among these, none is more evocative than the Grail. Whether understood as a chalice, a stone, a bloodline, or a body of forbidden knowledge, the Grail represents something that could destabilize authority simply by existing outside official control. The question, then, is not merely whether the Templars fled Europe, but what they may have taken with them. When the arrests of 1307 unfolded, royal agents expected to seize unimaginable wealth. Instead, they found far less than anticipated. Templar treasuries were not empty, but they were incomplete. Accounts did not balance. Assets vanished. This discrepancy has fueled speculation for centuries, often drifting into fantasy. Yet, even stripped of exaggeration, the reality remains. Something was moved. Gold is heavy, difficult to transport discreetly. But relics, manuscripts, and sacred objects are different. They can be concealed, divided, or entrusted to a small number of individuals. And for an order that believed itself charged with protecting divine mysteries, relocating such objects would have been an act of duty, not theft. The idea that the Grail, or what the Templars believed to be the Grail, was moved eastward may sound improbable at first. Grail legends are deeply embedded in European myth, but myth often forms around geography after the fact. Sacred objects move long before stories settle. There is precedent. Christianity itself moved east and west along trade routes. Relics traveled to avoid desecration during invasions. Libraries were evacuated. Icons were hidden. Survival required motion. If the Templars possessed an object or collection of texts that threatened ecclesiastical authority, keeping it within Europe after their condemnation would have been reckless. Even sympathetic rulers would not be able to protect such items indefinitely. Distance again offered safety. The East offered more than distance. It offered obscurity. In Central Asia, religious diversity was the norm. Buddhist monasteries, Christian churches, Islamic schools, and shamanic traditions coexisted. A sacred object from the West could be preserved without attracting the same attention it would in Europe. It could be reinterpreted, concealed, or simply kept silent. Some theories suggest that the Grail was not a physical object at all, but knowledge, genealogies, esoteric teachings, or philosophical frameworks inherited from ancient traditions. Such knowledge would be easier to transport than any artifact. It could be memorized, encoded, or translated. It could survive even if every physical trace was destroyed. If this were the case, the Silk Road becomes even more significant. It was not just a route for goods, but for ideas. Buddhist sutras traveled it. Islamic philosophy moved along it. Mathematical concepts crossed cultures through it. Knowledge was its most durable cargo. Templars trained in secrecy could have carried teachings eastward, integrating them into existing traditions or preserving them within small, closed communities. Over time, the origin of such knowledge would blur, absorbed into the intellectual fabric of the regions that received it. There are curious parallels that fuel this speculation. Certain Central Asian mystical traditions emphasize symbolic vessels, inner illumination, and sacred lineages, concepts that echo Grail symbolism. This does not prove transmission, but it invites comparison. Ideas resonate more easily when they find compatible ground. There is also the matter of protection. In Europe, the Grail is always endangered, sought by kings, coveted by enemies, guarded by secret orders. In the East, such an object would not hold the same political charge. Without an audience primed to recognize its significance, it could exist quietly. Critics argue that no clear trace of such an object exists in Asia. But absence is expected. Objects meant to remain hidden succeed by leaving no trail. Their survival is measured not by visibility, but by continuity. What is often overlooked is that the Templars themselves did not define the Grail as later storytellers did. Much of what we know about the Grail comes from literature written after the Order's rise. These stories may encode real concerns in symbolic form. They may hint at knowledge deemed dangerous to reveal openly. If the Grail represented legitimacy outside papal authority, then removing it from Europe would be an act of defiance and preservation. It would ensure that no king or pope could claim it. It would become a memory rather than a weapon. The East has long served this function in Western imagination, a place where dangerous knowledge is sent to be forgotten. Alchemy, astrology, and ancient sciences were often attributed to Eastern origins, whether or not this was accurate. The association itself made such knowledge harder to control. In this sense, sending the Grail eastward would not erase it. It would mythologize it. Over generations, stories would distort. Locations would shift. What was once a deliberate act of concealment would become legend. The Grail would be lost not because it vanished, but because it moved beyond the cultural frame that once defined it. Whether the Grail was a cup, a corpus of texts, or was something more abstract, the possibility of its eastward journey reframes the entire legend. It suggests that the mystery was not meant to be solved, but survived. And perhaps that is the most unsettling idea of all, that some secrets endure not by being guarded in one place, but by being carried beyond the reach of those who seek to control them. As the Templars vanished from Europe, their most precious charge, whatever it truly was, may not have been destroyed. It may have simply followed the road that history forgot to follow. Maps are more than tools of navigation. They are expressions of worldview, declarations of what is known and what is possible. In the medieval era, maps were rare, precious, and often deliberately imprecise to those not meant to understand them. To control a map was to control movement, trade, and power. For an organization like the Knights Templar, whose strength lay in coordination across vast distances, geographic knowledge was not a luxury. It was a necessity. The common image of medieval Europeans stumbling blindly at the edge of the world is misleading. While popular maps of the time often depicted monsters at the margins, practical navigational charts told a different story. Portal-on maps, used by sailors, were remarkably accurate along coastlines. Trade routes across land were memorized, annotated, and passed down through generations of merchants. The Templars, embedded in both maritime and overland networks, would have had access to the best geographic intelligence available. Their commanderies sat near major ports and crossroads. Their knights traveled frequently between Europe and the Levant. Their financial operations required reliable routes, and their survival depended on knowing where power lay and where it did not. If the Templars fled Europe, maps would have been among the most valuable assets they carried. Not decorative maps for display, but working knowledge, distances, water sources, political boundaries, seasonal hazards. Such knowledge could not be seized easily, nor could it be easily replaced. There are hints that the Templars' geographic understanding exceeded that of their contemporaries. Some early European maps display unexpected accuracy in regions far from Europe, including parts of Asia and Africa. While these maps are often attributed to later sources, their origins remain debated. One theory suggests that such knowledge did not emerge suddenly, but accumulated quietly through organizations that valued secrecy. The Templars, positioned at the crossroads of cultures, could have absorbed information from Muslim geographers, Jewish scholars, and Eastern travelers. This would have given them a composite understanding of the world unmatched by any single culture. The Islamic world, in particular, possessed advanced geographic knowledge. Scholars like Al-Idrisi created detailed maps based on extensive travel and reports. These works circulated widely in the Middle East. Templars operating in these regions would not have been isolated from such information. They would have encountered it, copied it, and integrated it into their own systems. Beyond the Islamic world lay Central Asia, where knowledge moved along the Silk Road as freely as goods. Chinese cartography, Persian astronomy, and Indian mathematics all intersected in these regions. Travelers exchanged information as a matter of survival. Knowing where a river flowed or where a mountain pass opened could mean the difference between life and death. If Templars traveled east, their maps would not have been static documents. They would have evolved with each journey. Routes would be updated, political shifts noted, new alliances marked. Over time, such maps would reflect a living understanding of Eurasia. The loss of these maps would explain much. It would explain why certain knowledge appears suddenly in Europe centuries later, without clear lineage. It would explain gaps in European awareness that do not align with known travel patterns. It would explain why some routes seem to be rediscovered repeatedly, as if previous knowledge had vanished. There are legends of Templar maps hidden or destroyed to prevent misuse. Some speak of maps showing lands beyond accepted boundaries, including connections to Asia or even across oceans. While such claims often drift into speculation, they underscore a central truth. Geographic knowledge was power, and power was dangerous. If the Templars carried their maps eastward, those maps may never have returned. They may have been absorbed into Mongol administrative systems, influencing trade routes and military campaigns. Or they may have been guarded within closed circles, passed down orally rather than visually. Or they may have been deliberately dismantled, knowledge distributed among individuals rather than preserved in a single vulnerable form. A route remembered is harder to confiscate than a map drawn. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. The European history lost access to certain knowledge not because it was destroyed, but because it left. When Europe later reconnected with Asia during the Age of Exploration, it often acted as if the routes were newly discovered. Yet many of these paths have been traveled centuries earlier. The difference lay not in discovery, but in documentation. The Templars, accused of secrecy and hidden knowledge, may have been custodians of a world map far larger than the one Europe was willing to acknowledge. Their destruction would then represent not only the loss of an order, but the loss of perspective. Critics rightly caution against attributing too much to one group. Knowledge is rarely monopolized, but influence is rarely equal. Organizations that prioritize information, secrecy, and long-term planning shape history disproportionately. The idea of lost maps is not romantic fantasy. It is a recognition of how fragile knowledge can be when tied to persecuted institutions. When libraries burn, when custodians are silenced, what disappears is not just ink on parchment, but pathways through the world. If some of those pathways led east, far beyond Europe's later narratives, then the Templars' disappearance takes on new meaning. They did not simply vanish. They took with them a vision of the world that Europe would spend centuries trying to rebuild. And perhaps the most enduring legacy of those lost maps is not where they led, but what they suggest, that history is shaped as much by what is forgotten as by what is remembered. There is a peculiar kind of silence that settles over certain questions in history. It is not the silence of ignorance, where nothing is known, but the silence of avoidance, where something is known, or at least suspected, but never fully pursued. The possibility that the Knights Templar did not simply dissolve within Europe, but escaped beyond it, into Asia and perhaps as far as Mongolia, exists within this kind of silence. Official history does not openly deny the idea. It simply does not engage with it. This absence is often mistaken for disproof. Yet historians know that silence in the record can be just as meaningful as presence, especially when the silence appears around events involving power, reputation, and institutional legitimacy. The destruction of the Knights Templar was not a natural decline. It was a political act. King Philip IV of France was deeply in debt to the order. By eliminating the Templars, he erased those debts and seized their assets. The papacy, weakened and pressured, sanctioned the move. What followed was not merely justice, but narrative control. Once the order was condemned, its story became dangerous. Any suggestion that the Templars survived, reorganized, or continued their mission elsewhere would undermine the authority of those who declared them destroyed. It would raise uncomfortable questions about competence, reach, and truth. It would suggest that the Church and Crown failed to fully eliminate what they labeled heretical. History, especially official history, tends to favor clean endings. Within Europe, records were curated, trials were documented, confessions extracted under torture were preserved because they justified the outcome. But what happened beyond Europe's borders lay outside the administrative interest of those writing the record. There was no incentive to follow the trail eastward. Doing so would only complicate the story. Over time, this selective attention hardened into consensus. Academic history, particularly in its modern form, relies heavily on surviving documents. If an event leaves no clear archival footprint, it is often treated with skepticism. This is a necessary discipline, but it can also become a limitation. Institutions that operate in secrecy, especially when fleeing persecution, do not leave neat paper trails. The Templars, even at the height of their power, were not transparent. Their internal rules were hidden, their rituals private, their communications coded. Expecting clear documentation of their escape routes misunderstands their nature. There is also a cultural factor. Western historical tradition has long drawn an artificial boundary between Europe and Asia, treating them as separate narratives. Events that cross this boundary tend to be minimized or framed as anomalies. The idea that a European order might integrate into Asian systems challenges this division. It suggests continuity where separation is preferred. Moreover, acknowledging such movement would require historians to grapple with the complexity of medieval globalization. It would require admitting that medieval Europe was not the sole driver of its own history, but part of a much larger, interconnected world. This is uncomfortable for narratives built on European exceptionalism. There is also the matter of reputational risk. For centuries, the Templars were portrayed either as villains or martyrs, depending on perspective. Introducing a third possibility, that they survived quietly, adapting pragmatically, complicates both views. It denies the drama of total destruction and the purity of noble sacrifice. Complex survival stories are harder to tell. Then there is the problem of authority. Once an interpretation becomes entrenched in textbooks, museums, and public consciousness, challenging it requires extraordinary evidence. Not because alternative ideas are wrong, but because institutions are slow to change. Careers are built on established frameworks. Funding follows consensus. Deviating from accepted narratives can be professionally risky. As a result, alternative hypotheses, no matter how plausible, are often labeled speculative and left unexplored. Yet history advances precisely when such hypotheses are examined seriously. Another layer of silence comes from geography. Much of the territory relevant to this story lies in regions that were, until recently, difficult for Western scholars to access. Political barriers, language differences, and limited archaeological exploration have all contributed to gaps in understanding. What is not studied remains unknown. What is unknown remains unspoken. This creates a feedback loop. Because the idea is not discussed, it is not researched. Because it is not researched, there is little evidence. And because there is little evidence, it is not discussed. Breaking this cycle requires curiosity rather than certainty. It is also worth considering whose voices were excluded. Mongol, Persian, and Central Asian perspectives were long marginalized in Western historiography. Their records were treated as peripheral. When they mentioned foreigners, those mentions were often dismissed as anecdotal. Yet these sources may hold the very clues Western archives lack. Silence, in this context, is not emptiness. It is a boundary drawn by habit. What makes the Templar question especially sensitive is that it intersects with issues of legitimacy, religious, political, and historical. If the Templars survived beyond Europe, then the narrative of righteous condemnation becomes unstable. It suggests that truth was not fully known, or worse, deliberately simplified. Institutions rarely revisit stories that undermine their moral authority. Over centuries, this silence became normalized. The question stopped being asked not because it was answered, but because it was inconvenient. It fell into the category of unnecessary speculation. Even as new discoveries in archaeology and comparative history continue to reveal how interconnected the medieval world truly was. The irony is that modern scholarship increasingly acknowledges medieval globalization in other contexts: trade, technology, disease, and diplomacy. Yet when it comes to institutions like the Templars, the implications of this interconnectedness are rarely followed to their logical conclusion. Why should soldiers, monks, and administrators be less mobile than merchants and monks? The silence persists not because the idea lacks merit, but because it exists between disciplines. It belongs partly to medieval European history, partly to Central Asian studies, partly to religious history, and partly to the study of secret societies. Fallen between categories, it belongs fully to none, and so it waits. To listen to this silence is not to abandon rigor. It is to recognize that history is shaped by what we choose to preserve and what we allow to fade. Some stories vanish not because they are false, but because they are difficult. As we move forward, the task is not to replace one certainty with another, but to reopen a question that was quietly closed long ago. Not to declare what happened, but to acknowledge what might have happened and why no one seemed eager to remember it. In that acknowledgement, the silence begins to speak. When written records grow thin, history does not disappear. It changes form. In places where literacy was limited or archives were never centralized, memory lived in stories, passed from elder to child, from clan to clan, shaped by repetition and survival. Mongolia, with its deep tradition of oral history, preserves its past not in libraries, but in voices. And within those voices are echoes that feel strangely familiar. Mongolian oral tradition is vast and layered. It remembers great khans, epic battles, migrations, and ancestral origins with remarkable persistence. Lineages are recited across generations. Clan identities are tied to stories of arrival. Who came from where, under what circumstances, and why they stayed. These stories are not always precise in dates or names, but they are consistent in themes. Among these themes are tales of foreign warriors who arrived from the far west. Not merchants, not missionaries, warriors. In some legends, these outsiders are described as heavily armored men who rode with discipline and fought in tightly organized units. They are portrayed as loyal to one another, bound by oaths that superseded clan ties. Unlike typical mercenaries, they did not fight merely for payment. They serve a code. What makes these stories unusual is not the presence of foreigners. Mongolia's history is filled with them, but the way these figures are remembered. They are often described as quiet, reserved, and secretive. Men who did not fully integrate into local belief systems, yet did not oppose them either. Men who prayed differently. Some legends speak of warriors who carried a cross-like sign or marked their dead with symbols unfamiliar to the steppe. These symbols are not always described visually, but they are remembered as distinct from Buddhist, shamanic, or Islamic markers. Over time, such details blur, but the sense of difference remains. Bloodlines add another layer to the mystery. Certain Mongolian clans tell stories of ancestors who were not native to the steppe, but arrived from distant lands and were absorbed through marriage or service. Physical descriptions sometimes accompany these tales: lighter eyes, different facial structures, or unfamiliar names that were later adapted into Mongolian forms. Modern genetics complicates these stories further. While Central Asia has always been a genetic crossroads, some isolated communities display markers that suggest European ancestry predating known modern contact. Genetics alone cannot identify Knights Templar, but it can confirm movement, people crossing boundaries long before recent history accounts for them. Critics rightly caution against romanticizing oral tradition. Stories evolve. They adapt. They incorporate myth. Yet oral memory is not arbitrary. It preserves what matters to identity. And what survives across centuries often reflects real encounters, even if details shift. The Mongols themselves were meticulous record keepers when it came to lineage and loyalty. To be accepted into a clan was not casual. Outsiders had to prove value, often through military service. Those who did were remembered, even if their origins were gradually mythologized. If Templars, or former Templars, entered Mongol service, they would not be remembered by their European titles. They would be remembered by what they did, how they fought, how they behaved, how they differed. Another recurring motif in these legends is disappearance. Some stories speak of warrior groups who arrived, served for a time, and then vanished, moving onward, dissolving into other regions, or retreating into obscurity. This transient presence aligns with the idea of small groups moving eastward rather than a single permanent settlement. There are also tales of sacred knowledge carried by outsiders, not in the form of books, but teachings, codes of conduct, symbols, or rituals passed quietly among initiates. These are not described as religious conversions, but as inherited wisdom that outsiders chose not to share widely. Such stories resonate uncomfortably well with what is known of the Templars. Of course, None of these legends names the Knights Templar explicitly, but they do not need to. Oral tradition remembers impact, not labels. A man's order may be forgotten, but his difference is not. The challenge for historians is methodological. Oral history does not fit neatly into academic frameworks built around documents and artifacts. It resists footnotes. It demands interpretation rather than citation. As a result, it is often sidelined. Yet when oral memory aligns with physical anomalies, symbolic traces, and historical plausibility, it deserves consideration. Mongolia's landscape itself reinforces memory. The steppe does not erase easily. Burial sites remain visible for centuries. Stone markers endure. A story attached to a place survives because the place remains unchanged. Travelers in Mongolia have occasionally reported local guides pointing to ruins or burial grounds associated with Western warriors or foreign guards. Such claims are rarely documented formally, often dismissed as folklore. But folklore is history remembered differently. There is also the matter of pride. Mongolian tradition honors strength, loyalty, and discipline, qualities admired regardless of origin. Foreign warriors who embodied these traits would be remembered favorably. They would be woven into the narrative of Mongol greatness, not excluded from it. This matters because it reframes the idea of refuge. The East was not merely a hiding place for the Templars. It may have been a place where their identity transformed from persecuted heretics into respected warriors, where survival did not require erasure, only adaptation. Over generations, adaptation becomes assimilation. Names change, symbols fade, stories simplify. What remains is essence, the echo of disciplined men from the West, the memory of oaths taken seriously, the sense that some outsiders were different, not conquerors, not traitors, but something in between. History often demands written proof. Memory offers something else, continuity. And continuity, even when imperfect, can reveal truths that documents alone cannot. As we listen to these echoes from the steppe, we are reminded that not all journeys end where records stop. Some end where stories begin. In the silence between fact and legend, the past waits, patient, unresolved, and still alive in the voices of those who remember. At this point in the journey, the question no longer feels distant or hypothetical. Piece by piece, a picture has emerged. Not sharp, not definitive, but coherent. Roads exist. Timing aligns. Motive is clear. Capability is unquestionable. And silence, once interpreted as absence, begins to resemble concealment. What remains is not a single piece of missing evidence, but the realization that the story itself may have been fragmented by design. The disappearance of the Knights Templar has long been framed as an ending, an abrupt collapse brought about by royal greed and ecclesiastical fear. But when viewed through a wider lens, one that stretches beyond Europe, this ending begins to look like a transition. Consider the convergence of forces in the early 14th century. In Europe, the Templars were condemned, their legitimacy stripped away, their survival criminalized. In Asia, the Mongol Empire stood at its height, open, pragmatic, hungry for talent, and indifferent to European theological disputes. Between these two worlds lay the Silk Road, fully operational, protected, and heavily trafficked. This is not coincidence. It is context. The Templars were uniquely positioned to exploit this context. They possessed the skills required to survive long-distance travel, the discipline to move in secrecy, and the incentive to leave Europe entirely rather than seek fragile refuge within it. They understood geopolitics. They anticipated threats, and they had already operated at the intersection of cultures for generations. What emerges from this convergence is not the image of a mass exodus, but something far more plausible: selective migration. Small groups, trusted men, chosen routes, knowledge carried in memory rather than chests, symbols abandoned or disguised, identities shed not out of shame, but necessity. In this light, the absence of explicit records becomes expected rather than suspicious. An organization that survived through secrecy would not announce its survival. It would dissolve outward, allowing its structure to disappear while its essence endured. The Mongol world offered exactly what the Templars needed at that moment: irrelevance to their past crimes. No inquisitors, no papal courts, no royal warrants, only utility. The evidence, taken individually, is fragile. A foreign chronicler's puzzled description, a symbol carved into stone, a legend whispered across generations, a map that appears too accurate for its time. None of these prove the case alone. But history is rarely proven by single artifacts. It is reconstructed through convergence. When independent strands, political logic, geographic possibility, cultural compatibility, and material traces begin to align, they form something stronger than proof. They form plausibility grounded in context. The climactic realization, then, is not that the Knights Templar definitively reached Mongolia, but that there is no compelling reason to believe they could not have, and several reasons to believe they may have. This realization challenges deeply ingrained assumptions about medieval history. It suggests that Europe was not the sole stage upon which its own institutions played out their final acts. It suggests that history's boundaries are often drawn not by reality, but by habit. If even a fraction of the Templars reached the East, the implications ripple outward. It means the story of medieval Europe does not end at the edge of Christendom. It means secret societies did not vanish, but adapted. It means that global history did not begin in the modern age. It was already unfolding, quietly, centuries earlier. This is the hidden chapter, not a tale of conquest or dominance, but of survival and transformation, of men forced to abandon titles and symbols, yet carrying with them a code shaped by centuries of discipline, of knowledge preserved not through monuments, but through movement. It also reframes the Templars themselves. They cease to be merely victims or villains. They become agents navigating a collapsing world, making choices under extreme pressure. Their disappearance becomes less tragic and more strategic. The reluctance of official history to engage with this possibility now appears less mysterious. Acknowledging such a chapter would require rethinking the nature of medieval power, the reach of institutions, and the artificial separation between East and West. It would complicate narratives that prefer isolation over interconnection. But complexity is where truth often resides. This hidden chapter does not ask us to abandon skepticism. It asks us to apply it evenly, to question not only extraordinary claims, but comfortable conclusions, to recognize that what we inherit as history is often the residue of decisions made by those who controlled the record. The Knights Templar were condemned by those in power. Their story was sealed by those who benefited from its simplicity. What escaped that seal may have escaped history's attention as well. And yet, traces remain. In the windswept plains of Central Asia, in stones marked with unfamiliar symbols, in legends that speak of disciplined men from the West, in maps that hint at forgotten knowledge, in silences that grow louder the longer we listen. The revelation, ultimately, is not about certainty. It is about permission, the permission to imagine medieval history as expansive, fluid, and interconnected, to accept that some answers lie not in archives, but between them. If the Knights Templar reached Mongolia, they did not do so to be remembered. They did so to endure. And endurance, unlike glory, rarely leaves a monument, but it leaves echoes. If we allow ourselves, even briefly, to accept the possibility that the Knights Templar did not simply vanish within Europe, but moved eastward into the wider Eurasian world, the consequences are profound. This single shift in perspective alters not only the fate of one medieval order, but the way we understand the Middle Ages themselves. It forces us to reconsider a period too often portrayed as isolated, static, and bounded by rigid cultural walls. The traditional narrative of medieval Europe rests on separation. Europe here, Asia there, Christianity here, the unknown beyond. Progress unfolding slowly, locally, and in isolation. But the story that has unfolded so far challenges every part of that framework. The Middle Ages were not a dark corridor between antiquity and modernity. They were crossroads. Trade networks spanned continents. Ideas crossed languages. Technologies moved from east to west and back again. The Silk Road did not merely connect markets, it connected worlds. If an institution as complex and mobile as the Knights Templar could dissolve into that system, then medieval globalization was not an exception. It was a condition. This realization forces us to rethink scale. Medieval institutions were not small or fragile. They were durable, adaptive, and capable of long-term strategy. The Templars managed assets across thousands of miles. They coordinated personnel in multiple kingdoms. They understood risk, leverage, and survival. Such capabilities do not vanish overnight. Instead, they reconfigure. If some Templars entered the Mongol world, they would have done so as part of an already global system. Their knowledge, once removed from European control, would become part of a broader exchange that included Chinese engineering, Persian administration, and Central Asian trade expertise. This is globalization, not driven by empires alone, but by people. It also changes how we view the Mongol Empire. Too often reduced to conquest and destruction, it emerges instead as a facilitator of connection. The Mongols created conditions under which unprecedented movement was possible. Their empire was not a cultural void, but a conduit. Within that conduit, identities were flexible. A man could be European by birth, Christian by belief, Mongol by service, and Central Asian by residence, all within a single lifetime. Such complexity resists simplistic labels. Rethinking medieval globalization also means rethinking knowledge transmission. Innovations did not appear in isolation. They travel with people. If the Templars carried geographic, financial, or technical knowledge eastward, that knowledge did not disappear. It was redistributed. Some ideas that later reemerged in Europe, banking practices, cartographic improvements, organizational models, may have deeper, more complex journeys than we acknowledge. Their paths may loop through regions we no longer associate with their development. This perspective also reframes the idea of lost history. History is not lost because it ceases to exist. It is lost because it moves beyond the narratives we continue to tell. When people cross cultural boundaries, their stories often fall between categories, claimed fully by none. The Templars, if they survived eastward, would belong to such a category. Neither European nor Asian in the way historians prefer. Their legacy would be distributed, diluted, and disguised by integration. It also alters how we interpret secrecy. Secret societies are often imagined as hoarders of power, but secrecy can also be a response to vulnerability. When institutions are threatened, secrecy becomes a tool of survival, not domination. The Templars' alleged secrecy may not reflect hidden ambition, but adaptation under persecution. Their disappearance becomes less a failure and more strategy. This shift challenges moral binaries. The Templars cease to be purely victims or villains. They become historical actors navigating a collapsing order. Their choices, whether we admire them or not, reflect intelligence under pressure. There are implications, too, for how we understand identity. Medieval identity was not fixed. It was negotiated. Religion, language, and allegiance could change over time. Modern assumptions about rigid medieval identities distort this reality. If Templars integrated into Mongol society, their descendants, if any, would not identify as such. They would carry fragments, not labels. Memory would survive in habits, values, and stories rather than names. This also affects how we view the boundary between legend and history. Legends often preserve truths that formal records cannot. They encode experiences that were never meant to be written down. Dismissing them outright impoverishes our understanding. Rethinking medieval globalization does not mean accepting every alternative theory uncritically. It means expanding the range of questions we consider legitimate. It means acknowledging that our current narratives are provisional, shaped by what survived rather than what happened. Perhaps the most significant change is philosophical. It invites humility. History is not a closed book. It is a mosaic assembled from fragments, many of which are missing. When we encounter patterns that do not fit our expectations, the responsible response is not dismissal, but investigation. If the Knights Templar reach Mongolia, even in small numbers, they remind us that history does not belong to borders. It belongs to movement. They remind us that the medieval world was already global, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably, and that the forces shaping our modern interconnected world were already at work long before the age of exploration gave them new names. In this light, the story is no longer about whether a group of knights cross continents. It is about whether we are willing to follow history where it leads, even when it leads us beyond the maps we inherited. Because once we do, the Middle Ages cease to be distant and foreign. They become recognizably human, full of fear, ambition, adaptability, and the relentless drive to survive in a changing world. Section 16, Epilogue. The road still untraveled as the story begins to settle. The noise of argument and evidence fades, leaving behind something quieter and more enduring. Not an answer carved in stone, but a path stretching into the distance. The kind of path history rarely illuminates fully because it does not lead to certainty. It leads to reflection. Imagine the Silk Road at dusk. The caravans have slowed. The heat of the day loosens its grip on the land. Wind moves through tall grass and desert sand alike, carrying with it the sound of bells tied to animals, the murmured prayers of travelers, the creak of leather worn smooth by countless miles. This road has no beginning and no end. It exists wherever people choose to move forward. Somewhere along this road, centuries ago, walked men whose names we no longer know. They were not kings. They left no monuments. They did not write histories of their own survival. If they once wore white cloaks marked with red crosses, those garments were long discarded. If they once answered to grand masters and papal decrees, those authorities no longer mattered. What mattered was endurance. History remembers those who conquer and those who fall. It rarely remembers those who adapt. If the Knights Templar reached the east, whether to Mongolia or merely far beyond Europe's borders, their journey was not about escape alone. It was about choosing continuity over extinction, about understanding that survival sometimes requires letting go of identity while preserving purpose. This epilogue does not claim discovery. It claims possibility. The road remains untraveled, not because it never existed, but because it leads away from familiar conclusions. It leads us to imagine medieval people not as static figures trapped within borders, but as agents capable of profound change, capable of movement, compromise, and reinvention. The silence surrounding this story now feels different. It no longer feels like denial. It feels like space left by history for us to explore thoughtfully rather than fill hastily. Perhaps the Templars did reach Mongolia. Perhaps they did not. What matters is that the question itself exposes something deeper, that history is wider than the narratives handed down to us, that what we call the end is often just the edge of our attention. The Silk Road still exists in fragments, roads, ruins, memories, and stories passed quietly through generations. It reminds us that human history is not a straight line, but a web of intersecting journeys. And somewhere within that web are lives lived in transition, identities reshaped by necessity, and truths preserved not in books, but in movement. As the night deepens and the road disappears into darkness, one final thought remains. Some histories are not meant to be proven. They are meant to be followed. And the road, as always, is still there, waiting for those willing to walk it. As the long arc of this story begins to quiet, what remains is not an answer, but an atmosphere, a sense of distance, of time stretching outward rather than closing in, the kind of feeling that lingers after a journey where the destination was never the true purpose. The Knights Templar, the Silk Road, Mongolia, all of them now feel less like fixed points on a map and more like coordinates in a much larger human story about movement, survival, and the refusal to disappear. History often rewards conclusions. It prefers firm endings, clear victories, and definitive defeats. But real lives rarely obey those preferences. They unfold unevenly, adapting to pressure, changing shape when threatened, and continuing in ways that later observers struggle to recognize. The epilogue of the Templars may not be written in executions or dissolutions, but in footsteps that fade into dust. Picture the road again, not as a line, but as a rhythm. The Silk Road was never silent, yet it was never loud either. It carried the steady pulse of humanity, traders negotiating at dawn, guards watching the horizon, monks murmuring prayers in languages their companions did not understand. It was a place where no one asked too many questions, because survival depended on cooperation more than certainty. If former Templars walked this road, they would have walked it quietly, not as knights of a fallen order, but as men who understood that identity can be set aside without being lost. Titles fall away more easily than values. Symbols can be discarded while discipline remains. Loyalty does not require banners. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable idea for modern history to accept, that an institution can survive without being visible, that continuity does not require recognition. We are accustomed to equating survival with legacy and legacy with documentation. But for those under threat, survival often means choosing obscurity. The Templars were trained to think beyond individual lives. They planned for generations. They believed in systems rather than moments. When those systems collapsed in Europe, the instinct to rebuild elsewhere would have been natural. Not dramatic, not emotional, simply necessary. And necessity does not announce itself. The men who may have reached the East would not have spoken of loss. They would not have clung to memories of what was taken from them. To do so would be dangerous. Nostalgia can be fatal when survival demands adaptation. Instead, they would have learned new customs, new hierarchies, new ways of belonging. The Mongol world, vast and indifferent to European grievances, would have offered something rare, a future unburdened by accusation. No inquisitors asked who they once were. No kings demanded confessions. Only ability mattered, only usefulness. Over time, usefulness becomes trust. Trust becomes belonging. Belonging becomes memory. This is how histories vanish, not through destruction, but through absorption. Centuries later, we search for names and find none. We look for monuments and see only ruins. We expect declarations and find whispers. And we mistake that absence for impossibility. But absence can also mean success. The road still untraveled is not untraveled because no one walked it. It is untraveled because it does not lead where we expected history to go. It leads away from Europe's central narrative and into a shared human one, where borders blur and identities dissolve into experience. It invites us to imagine medieval history not as a series of isolated civilizations, but as overlapping worlds constantly influencing one another. It reminds us that global history did not begin with modern empires. It has always been there, moving slowly, patiently, often unnoticed. There is something deeply human in this idea. When threatened with annihilation, people do not always fight. Sometimes they move. Sometimes they change. Sometimes they carry what matters most and leave the rest behind. If a Knights Templar did this, then their greatest act was not defiance or secrecy, but humility, the willingness to disappear so that something of them might endure. This reframes the meaning of legacy. Legacy is not always something you leave behind intentionally. Sometimes it is what survives despite your efforts to remain unseen. The road still exists, not physically in every place, but conceptually. It exists wherever people cross boundaries under pressure, wherever cultures blend, wherever knowledge moves quietly between worlds, wherever identity proves flexible enough to survive. The Silk Road is not gone. It has changed form, but its logic remains. Trade routes become digital pathways. Cultural exchange accelerates. Power still seeks to control narratives, and individuals still find ways to slip between those controls. In this sense, the Templar story is not ancient. It is timeless. It asks us to consider how many other histories have taken similar paths, how many groups, ideas, and individuals have survived by becoming unrecognizable to those who hunted them. How many stories we no longer tell simply because they do not fit the shape of what we expect the past to look like. As listeners, as thinkers, as inheritors of history, our role is not to close this story, but to sit with it, to allow uncertainty without discomfort, to recognize that not knowing is sometimes more honest than insisting on certainty. The road still untraveled is an invitation to rethink what survival looks like, to question what disappearance really means, to listen more carefully to silence, to symbols, to stories passed quietly rather than proclaimed loudly. Somewhere beyond the edge of familiar maps, the past continues to breathe, not in stone or ink, but in motion. And perhaps that is where the Knights Templar truly belong, not in the firelight of execution stakes or the shadows of ruined castles, but on the road itself. Always moving, always adapting, always just beyond the reach of those who believed history could be controlled. The road does not end. It waits. As this journey reaches its final stretch, it does not arrive at a destination marked by certainty. Instead, it opens onto a horizon, vast, quiet, and unresolved. This is the nature of history when it brushes against truth that was never meant to be preserved neatly. The story of the Knights Templar, when followed beyond the familiar borders of Europe, does not end in fire or execution. It fades into distance, into movement, into roads that continue long after the chroniclers stop writing. Picture the world not as it appears in modern atlases, but as it existed in the early 14th century. A world without sharp borders. A world defined by routes rather than nations. Power did not reside only in capitals. It lived along corridors of movement. Rivers, passes, caravan roads, and steppe paths mattered more than lines on parchment. To live in such a world was to understand that survival depended not on permanence, but on motion. The Silk Road was the greatest expression of this reality. It was not owned by any single empire, faith, or people. It endured because it adapted. When wars closed one path, another opened. When cities fell, others rose. It was a system designed by human necessity, refined by centuries of use. And it was along this system that countless lives slipped beyond the reach of written history. If the Knights Templar reached the East, they did not do so as an army marching beneath banners. They would have moved as fragments, men stripped of insignia, carrying no symbols that could betray them. The Red Cross that once defined their identity would have become a liability, not a badge of honor. Survival would demand erasure of the visible self and preservation of the invisible one. What remains difficult for the modern mind to accept is that disappearance can be intentional. We are conditioned to believe that if something mattered, it would be recorded. But history is written by those who remain in power, not by those who escape it. The Templars' enemies controlled the narrative in Europe. Beyond Europe, no one had reason to continue telling their story as such. And so the order vanished, not into nothingness, but into anonymity. Men who once answered to grandmasters may have learned to answer to khans. Men trained in rigid hierarchy may have adapted to new systems of loyalty. Their vows would not have vanished overnight, but they would have been reshaped by necessity. Oaths taken in one world do not always survive intact in another. Some are abandoned. Others are internalized, stripped of form, but preserved in spirit. If descendants existed, they would not know themselves as Templars. They would know themselves as members of clans, families, or communities shaped by entirely different histories. The past would survive only in subtle ways, in values, habits, and perhaps an inherited sense that some knowledge is meant to be guarded quietly rather than displayed. This is how history truly disappears, not in destruction, but in transformation. The uncomfortable truth is that most human lives are never recorded. Entire communities rise and fall without leaving more than traces. Archaeology uncovers fragments, Oral tradition preserves echoes. Written history captures only a narrow slice of experience, usually aligned with authority. Everything else slips through the cracks. The story we have followed asks us to look into those cracks without expecting them to close neatly. Perhaps the Knights Templar reached Mongolia. Perhaps they went only part of the way. Perhaps they fragmented across many regions, leaving no single destination to point to. All of these possibilities remain open. What no longer seems reasonable is the assumption that they simply cease to exist where the records end. Because people do not disappear so easily. They move. They adapt. They survive. The medieval world rewarded those who understood this. The Mongol Empire, for all its brutality, was built on the principle of adaptability. It absorbed talent wherever it found it. It valued function over origin. In such an environment, the past mattered far less than usefulness. For men fleeing persecution based on identity, this was not chaos. It was freedom. Freedom from labels. Freedom from accusations. Freedom from the need to justify survival. What we confront here is not merely an alternative historical theory, but a challenge to how we think about history itself. We're taught to trust documents above all else. Yet documents are fragile. They burn. They are edited. They are created with intent. Silence in documents often reflects political decisions, not absence of events. The destruction of the Templars was a political act. The narrative that followed was a political convenience. Any survival beyond Europe undermined the authority of those who claimed total victory. Silence was not accidental. It was functional. Over time, that silence hardened into assumption. Assumption hardened into consensus. And consensus became tradition. To question that tradition is not to reject history. It is to take it seriously enough to admit its limits. This epilogue does not ask you to believe blindly. It asks you to sit with uncertainty without fear. To recognize that some truths resist closure, not because they are false, but because they are complex. The Middle Ages were not primitive. They were not static. They were deeply interconnected. People traveled astonishing distances with no guarantee of return. They crossed cultural, religious, and linguistic boundaries routinely. The idea that an order as sophisticated as the Knights Templar could not do the same is a modern misconception. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of this story is how unsettling it feels. It unsettles because it removes the comfort of finality. It denies us a clean ending. It suggests that power does not always win, that persecution does not always destroy, and that some institutions survive by becoming unrecognizable. History prefers martyrs to survivors. Martyrs fit narratives. Survivors complicate them. As the road fades into darkness, one realization remains clear. The question itself matters more than the answer. Because asking it forces us to see history not as a fixed sequence of events, but as a living process shaped by human choice. Some chose execution. Some chose surrender. Some may have chosen the road. And the road does not preserve names. It preserves motion. It preserves the quiet resilience of those who walk away from the stories written about them, and into lives no one thought to record. The Silk Road still exists in fragments, sometimes buried beneath sand, sometimes traced by highways, sometimes remembered only in legend. It has carried empires, faiths, plagues, technologies, and people. It has carried endings and beginnings alike. If the Knights Templar walked that road eastward, they did not vanish from history. History simply failed to follow. And perhaps that is the final lesson. That history is not what happened. It is what we remember. And beyond the edge of memory, the road continues, still untraveled, still waiting, still full of lives that refuse to end where the story said they should.